It's time to get this ball rolling.
Let's get this party started.
So welcome to the Excellent Science Writing Panel. I'm Ray Pendergrass. I'll be the moderator. I am also a science writer, but I'm not excellent, so I'm here to ask the experts what they're doing.
Lies and falsehoods
Respectfully
already.
disagree.
So I would love to go down the line and have each of you introduce yourselves and say, like, what kind of science writing do you do? Because there's so many different types. So starting with you.
Hi, I'm Bethany Brookshire. I was a scientist. I got better, and now I am a science journalist. This is a scientist over here. Anyway, I'm now a science journalist, and I write science news articles. I write feature articles, which are different. I write books. My book is coming out in December. Please buy 10 copies. Oh, yes. That is my book. I actually have QR codes available. I will put those up. And I also have a podcast called Science for the People. So I do science communication and science journalism in multiple formats.
I'm Rachel Burks. I'm a chemist and a chemistry professor, and I write a column, kind of forensic science meets true crime kind of a column. And then I also do like limited podcast series, usually around science, pop culture, sciencey crime kind of stuff. And so I try to stick to more of the short form scripts for kind of limited series things.
Oh, you're done. Okay. How y'all doing? I'm Danielle Lee. I have done a little bit of everything. So blogging. I've contributed chapters to science writing books. Right now I'm primarily doing what we call traditional science writing. So writing manuscripts, like summarizing research, writing grants, and helping my students write. I'm focusing on that. And commentary, a lot of science and society commentary.
Hey everybody, I'm Joseph Meany. Like most of the other panelists, I come from a traditional academic background in science, but now I'm actually a science consultant for the government. So I have a lot of different trajectories. I also have a book. So I'm a materials scientist, and I wrote a book on graphene, the carbon-based nanomaterial. So you can check that out.
Awesome. So we've got such a wealth of experience on this panel. I love it. My first question would be, as a science writer, you probably have a better idea than other folks of how to identify good science writing. What are some of the tells that something is either good or very, very bad?
Well, I'll start with the bad, because sometimes knowing what it's not is a really good place to start. If they make a lot of broad, sweeping generalizations, that's usually not good science writing. If the only way to communicate with you is to scare the bejesus out of you, that's usually not good. It means they don't trust you enough
with
to
murder hornets.
Yeah, if it's just designed to shock you into doing things, that's not actually helping you make a decision. Good science is information that helps you evaluate, do I go left or right, or yes or no, or to what degree. So those are the things to really be mindful of. So do a gut check. If it feels a little like overwhelming or too much, it's probably not great. Now, real science is still weird, uncomfortable sometimes, but it shouldn't be focusing on, brainstem decision making. It should be a little bit more frontal cortex to make you think.
I would actually go even further than that. I would say if you're reading a piece of science writing and you're nodding along going, yeah, I agree with this, look twice.
Yeah, absolutely.
If you are about to share something because it feels good to you, take a minute. Because the stuff that I see most often shared on Facebook, in particular, my mom, she's sharing things because she agrees with them, and she's sharing things because it feels good, but she is not checking them. And they're often really, really wrong. So if you have a gut agreement with something, stop.
I always look at, actually, it's funny, before I get to the article, who wrote it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So there, like anything else, who wrote the thing that you're looking at? There are just certain people that are more trustworthy than others. And
outlets, certain outlets that are more trustworthy.
I'm not going to get my science news from the Daily Mail. I mean, that's, that's a bold, sweeping claim on my part, but, looking at, but also on the flip side though, wouldn't get it from New York Times style section because they've really published some real outrageous crap, and they call it beauty and style. But you're publishing things that go against what we know currently about health and quote wellness, and you're wrapping it up in quote wellness, and it can be very damaging to people. So who's writing it? And the other one would be anything that's like a one life hack. Right? Do this one thing, and usually it's lose weight, get clearer skin, your entire life will improve, you'll attract this life
Or
partner.
you can throw away all your prescription meds.
Yeah, anything I'm like, really? Because I don't think my diabetic relative should do that. Like those types of things really, really kind of take a pause at.
Yeah, if your headline can be blocked by an ad blocker, that's probably a...
That's a good one.
But so then I'd kind of like to pose the question back to the remainder of the group. You know, how can people wading into science, especially science journalism, very early on, identify key markers for people who are trustworthy, outlets that are trustworthy, to help take those first steps into curating their online space?
Well, I mean, I think one of them is sometimes you'll see science writing, especially in sometimes tech spaces, and it's like, oh no, you're just trying to either prop up, which bigotry of the week are you trying to prop up? And we've seen a real rise in that recently with transphobia wrapped up and disguised as, you can call it what you want, but I'm not stupid enough to fall for it. So things that are kind of, they feed into the reemergence of race science, or they feed into really it's the new thing we know about gender, and you're like, I don't know, sounds like the old thing we knew about gender. And that kind of stuff is, I'm like, let me take a deeper look, and at least a second glance, like you're saying, is, and the fact of the matter is, it might be something you agree with because it feeds into your own biases. But then you have to really think, okay, what is this? Why am I reading this, and why am I nodding along? And the one's like, ooh, what part of me is it signaling to? That part I really have to be like, ooh, I don't. This, and that's it. Maybe it's because then it's like, ooh, let me take a step away. But that's one of the big, I think, red flags would be, what hate of the week is this thing stoking? And there's a lot of, especially pernicious lately, is it's wrapped up in tech, it's wrapped up in, it's facial recognition. I'm like, that's just new racism, especially in the true crime area. You can call it whatever you want. It's the new way to predict criminality, and you're like, yeah, it sounds like race science to me.
Sounds like phrenology.
I'm like, we've seen this before in literally every century.
And they made a movie about it called Minority Report.
Yeah.
Are there folks in the space who you think are especially good examples that you could point folks to?
I actually wouldn't even necessarily talk about who, though I would say a byline. The phrase that science journalists use, and journalists in general, is the byline. That is who wrote the article. Look at it, click through, find out who they are, find out what they're doing. There's actually kind of a checklist that I look at when I'm looking through a science article to see if it's something that I feel pretty cool about. So first off, I would say, who's the byline? What's the outlet? Is it the Russian Times? Run, right? Look through big sweeping claims. Do they speak to the author in person? Okay. Do they speak to someone who is not on the paper and get their opinion of what the paper said? That is what journalists call outside comment.
Directly link to the paper.
Yeah,
Do they
that's the
directly
other-
link to the paper? Do they say what journal the paper is published in? These are all pretty good identifiers of someone who at least has gone to school for science journalism.
Yeah, that's true. But here's the thing to keep in mind, that the average American isn't getting what I call first-run science journalism. They're getting summarized information, which isn't bad, but understand that the average outlet, whether it is your newspapers or TV stations, they're taking a summary from somewhere else. then going through it one more time if they're lucky. And so you won't see quotes at all. You may not see those links to those papers, which is unfortunate. But that's one of the things that you still want to look for. It's like, are they just talking about this new sensationalist study? That's the other thing, like a study out of fancy university, if they won't name the team, like naming the university is usually a signal to get by with something. Or fancy university studies say, but they won't name the researchers. Not that you
Ivy League University says.
yeah.
It's the
And because
University of Pennsylvania.
yeah, the university actually doesn't say anything. Universities are just a physical place, maybe that research happened at, and probably not even that. And so that's actually that's something that the average person may not know. And you may not know the researchers, but naming the researcher is still critically important to go, did this person actually participate in the study in question?
And I mean, I think that's really important. The other thing to look for, who paid for it?
Big time.
Who paid for it? And if there is a link to the study in the piece, you can actually find that out. It will be at the end. In the acknowledgement section, there will be a, hey, this was funded by, NIH grant such and such, or this was funded by L'Oreal,
Yeah.
or this was funded by, I don't know, the Council for the Advancement of Racist People, right?
If only it were no, and not to say that there can't be. I mean, I
Koch
feel like
brothers.
and I don't even own any L'Oreal products. They have a great lab. They have scientists that work there.
They also have a
It's-
really excellent funding program
Yeah.
for young female
But
scientists
it's about,
in particular,
did you
which is great.
disclose it?
Yes.
Right. I'm sure. How many people here have read something, especially in the realm of what men want, what women want, whatever, and they're like, survey shows, and I'm like, I'm waiting for it. Give it to me. I'm waiting for it. Where is it? 2 links later, the survey is from Bumble or Grindr or that kind of thing, and then you're like, okay, so it is still about kind of, well, who did the work? Because survey data is actually really hard to write a survey that gets to the question you're actually trying to ask, and so that kind of thing can be really tricky. But and also the transparency. Where is it that you're disclosing some of these things? Are you burying it? Are you trying to bury it? Are you kind of trying to obscure, or are you being as upfront as possible? And the other thing is if the article, they don't admit that things are very difficult at some point, if everything seems like, oh, and then this was easy and this is effortless and we know this, it's like, science doesn't work that way. Even the stuff we think is simple, it's not. At some point, I want them to say, it's really hard in some form, and say that in
Danielle got bit 72 times in her last.
I'm just wondering. I really would like to see an article when they're like, "Oh, this great discovery. What do you think?" Like, we were surprised. We had no idea this was gonna happen. That's usually the answer. Or somebody did something. It was like, "Oh, that was a lark."
That's why I love the hashtag overly honest method.
Yeah,
where you
overly
get,
honest methods.
Right, scientists who really reveal, actually, it was because we ran out of this, and that was right next to it, and it looked kind of the same.
Yeah.
Whatever that is, some transparency, and some real. Not everything should sound like a Hollywood script.
The other thing that I would say is really important in terms of transparency and funding, when you're looking at the byline, watch out for things written by universities.
Yeah.
So those are called press releases, and they are often great. They are often perfectly fine. They are fine. I would never say they are not fine, right? I've written some. They're great. But keep in mind that is not journalism.
Yeah.
That is science communication, but it is not journalism.
Yeah.
And the difference is a university, if they're writing a press release about something, it's because they paid for it, and that means they want to look good.
Yeah.
Yes.
Also, the quotes in press releases aren't usually actually written by the people being quoted.
They're 100% not. No.
Speaking as someone who's writing them right now. So you all mentioned that we see sort of secondhand journalism a lot of times, and we don't often see people who do these interviews or get sort of outside comment. But, from my experience, most outlets pay you $200 to $400 an article.
Yeah.
So it's not easy. It's not just that the journalists are not doing their job. It's that they do not have the resources to do their job.
Facts.
So I'm kind of curious what other elements you think are causing some of this difficulty in science
I think
journalism
we
right now.
absolutely have to stress that the field of journalism overall, especially specialty journalism, has taken a huge hit.
Massive.
And science journalism in this era, especially, you would think in the, well, maybe we know why, the climate change and the impact on marginalized communities, we need it now more than ever, especially with computation and tech and how that's covered. So absolutely the financial angle. They want all of this. They want the public. They don't want to pay for the expertise.
Yeah.
So I mean, absolutely would say that. And so it's hard to work around that. But also, it also depends on what you push. You know, I've seen certain outlets they want to make a king or a queen. They want to push a certain personality above actually their product, and so they're going to market the hell out of it.
Yeah.
And so that they're making editorial decisions, right? But the other thing is there's some great science communication. So sometimes we too fall into the elitist trap of I'm only going to look at the Post, the Time, or whatever we think is, these things. But there's been some really great pieces, Teen Vogue.
Yes.
Yeah.
Teen Vogue
Vogue
actually.
has really
winning.
showed us
Yeah,
all up.
never underestimate Teen Vogue science health coverage.
Really
A
good.
plus,
I-
really very
Sight
good.
unseen, I would put my money on Teen Vogue every time. Like,
Teen Vogue.
Yeah.
Essence has done some good stuff.
Yeah.
Atlantic Black Star, which is kind of a historic black paper.
I actually wrote a really carefully fact-checked piece for Good Housekeeping.
Yes.
Yeah.
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 Reader's Digest. I mean, that
Yeah.
was kind of a staple growing up in my dad's kind of side of the house, and like my grandparents. I think they had a that
Back of every toilet, you gotta have your.
you gotta have the so yeah. I mean, I think that there are those things out there, and also thinking things like Popular Mechanic.
Yeah, that's actually a really
Right.
good science. They have some good science and engineering.
So really kind of a little bit outside the box, but I also think one of the great, as you know from coming to Dragon Con, is some of the best science communication is at that intersection of pop culture and science. And they are talking about the top research and what's happening now, and they're being quite current, but they also tend to do this is kind of how we know this works, doesn't work, and kind of works like this. And so sometimes that kind of outlet that might be produced by a Disney Plus or what, as like a little nugget or a backstory or whatever, might actually have like some really good science bits in there, education and information. So I think there is that kind of sprinkling in. You are finding these sources in a lot of places, mainly because they also pay the bills.
Yep.
And I would also, to add on to that, never underestimate children's science outlets.
Oh, yeah.
Never underestimate.
Great children's science podcasts.
I would actually say
Yeah.
some of the children's stuff is where they're still investing.
Yes.
Yeah, they're still
Yes.
investing in the profession for media for children and teens, and it seems to be a big disinvestment for things aimed at adult audiences across the board,
So
unfortunately.
Mission Impossible on TV. I think it's on CBS. That's kind of a Saturday morning, kind of with the cartoons, kind of so marketed towards kids to maybe mid-teens would be that kind of market. And again, it's just solidly good information.
I mean, there's really good science and nature education in highlights.
Yes,
It's really
actually,
good. Okay.
Yeah.
That brings me way
Someday
back.
I want to write for highlights.
Actually, they reach out all the time to scientists to write pieces, like children's pieces. But yeah, I would say some good science communication and science journalism is still being paid for folks who have children and teen audiences. But that's the problem. It's like they've devalued the profession, and as a result, we now have lots of people who have now lived through several years, if not a decade or more, without knowing what good journalism is, period. Not just good science journalism is. And there's this false perception that because you can look anything up, then we don't need journalists anymore. The information's just out there. But
Well,
journalists...
I've done my own research.
Yeah, I've done my own
Yeah.
research. Yeah. People, and it says so much about how little we either understood journalism as a profession or respected it. But, like, that's a real profession. Like, to suss out a story, to evaluate, to present it in a way. Like, those are skills, expertises. And you simply reading information and distilling it isn't that simple. And if even if everyone was able to do that, the ability of lots of people to do it becomes minimized. And I think that's by design. We want people too distracted, too busy to really be fully informed to make good decisions, which is why I think a lot of places use shortcuts. We use those emotional shortcuts to be like, well, just don't do it because it'll kill you or make you feel like you've been foolish or stupid. And so that's not good decision making. Good journalism makes you feel informed and empowered to make a decision. Not, I'm so scared, I feel like I've been duped, now I have to be reactionary and do something.
Although you might feel scared.
You still might feel scared because science, I mean,
Climate change is terrifying.
especially honestly in the last 3 years. I think some of the best coverage on coronavirus and kind of our response to it and everything has been Ed Young at the Atlantic.
Yeah.
He won a
which
Pulitzer
he won
for
a
a reason.
Pulitzer. And sure, I think everything I wrote, I'm like, wow, how terrifying. But also, this is what we would need to do.
Yeah,
to
it
course
wasn't
correct.
written just to scare
Yeah.
the bejesus out of you. It was written to inform you so that you have a nugget to be like, okay, now I need to do A, B, and C, as opposed to, oh no, tell me what to do, great leader in the sky.
Well, now I'm going to tell you what to do, great leader in the sky. No.
So what resources would you want to have if you had, if we did value science journalism at the level that we did? Are there any resources that you wish were more widely available or widely used?
Well, I would point to the one full-time science journalist.
What's up, guys?
Yeah.
Because I'm a dilettante. I dabble.
Oh, for the good Lord's sake, pay me at least $1 a word. Come on.
Yeah.
That's what I want. No, so, yeah, I did actually want to add on to that. So, are y'all aware that media is strapped for cash?
Yeah.
Do you know why? So, it's partially marketing, it's partially not. When was the last time you paid to read an article on the internet? When was the last time you saw that you had to pay to read an article on the internet and went, screw it?
Open
Yeah.
incognito tabs.
Open incognito tab. Yes, I mean, we have all been there. And that is part of the issue associated with why media are so cash strapped, right? There was a time back before the internet, when dinosaurs still roamed the earth, when, people, you wanted to read the Washington Post, you had to buy a subscription to the Washington Post, right? Now you just need an incognito tab or 10, right? Unless you want to pay for it via Amazon. But yes, so there's been major problems and cuts in the stream of cash flow to major media organizations. And this is coupled with the fact that they all know that in order to get people to pay for them, they need more and more and more eyeballs, which means more and more and more content, that constant refreshing, right? And so they're just more and more and more stories for less and less and less money. So, for example, I, as a journalist of some experience, I've been writing for 18 years-ish. I do not, in general, write for less than $1 a word, okay? Guess who pays less than $1 a word? The Atlantic.
Oh.
For freelancers, they pay 50 cents a word.
Ouch.
It's true. Sierra Magazine, 50 cents a word. Oh, yeah. The New York Times. Many of these places just will not pay because they are trying to churn through just so much work. So if I had to say stuff that I needed, I would love $1 or more per word. I actually know a guy, he's a very famous science writer who shall remain unnamed, and he does not stir for less than $8 a word.
Ooh.
He writes the word beer and he can buy you one. And I'm like, I want to be you. How do I be you?
I've seen some stuff happening in the independent, investigative news realms, especially where they have some sort of setup of a Patron-like system or asking people to invest in investigative independent journalism. So I've done that. I've been a contributor of Offing magazine where they
so I've also seen the rise of subscription newsletters as journalists try to support themselves. And I do think that's one model. I am terrified to start a Substack. Please don't make me start a Substack. Because then if you're getting paid for by a small audience, you are beholden to that audience, right? If you have your own paid-for Discord, where you're developing your own paid-for Discord community, you are beholden to those people. They pay your bills.
Yeah.
And that is not what journalism in theory should be about. the whole concept of what journalism should be about is someone sitting there being like, I serve the interests of the people, my reading audience. I serve what they need to know, right? So the science that I'm picking to tell you about is the stuff that I feel that you need or want to know about, in theory. In reality, it gets hairier than that. But things I would need to actually do science journalism the way I want to do it is actually what I did to write this book. Was I got a book advance, and I got 18 months. I got to travel around the world to a very limited extent because of this pandemic thing that happened. It was real awkward. But I got to travel. I got to meet the scientists. I got to accompany them. I got to see their work. A lot of the time when I'm reporting a piece for a magazine or something, I'm just calling these guys on the phone, right? And you can get something by calling a dude on the phone or Zoom or whatever. It's not the same as going there and seeing it happen, because they can't fake that for you, right? They can't put a good spin on it if you are there hunting Burmese pythons in the Everglades. Like,
Always comes back to the pythons.
Always.
it was an iconic experience. So yeah, I mean, but all of that takes money and it takes time.
It does.
And the other thing that I would really, really love that fewer and fewer outlets are doing, a fact checker. So there are specialty trained
Yep.
science journalists, people, and journalists in general, who are trained to check your facts. Because yes, I am citing every single thing I do. And every sentence I write, there is a, oh, that's according to this paper, oh, that's according to this interview with this guy, oh, that's according to this paper, and so on. But books are long, articles are long, and I am tired. And so it's really nice to have another pair of eyes going through, checking through every single fact. And I will give this, like, Good Housekeeping doesn't just check every fact, they call your sources.
What?
Yeah.
And they say,
That's
oh, did
good.
you say this?
Yeah.
I'm serious.
Yeah.
This is the best fact checking I've ever had.
All right.
Yeah.
Good housekeeping, y'all.
Get
Lose
into
10
it.
pounds by Friday and get some good.
The other thing that I would love, and that is becoming more widespread, which I really appreciate, is where necessary, sensitivity readers.
Yeah.
So that's basically like if, like, I'm a white lady, in case you cannot tell. And when I write about people who are not white ladies, I might do it wrong. It's really good to be able to have a member of the community about which I am writing, if they can't write the piece themselves, which would be ideal, to go through it and say, these are terms that we do not use. This is a concept that we do not believe in. Stuff like that. It's extremely important and very difficult. And if you want those people, you need to pay them.
Yeah.
Yeah, don't flow. I mean, I think at different times we've gotten different asks. That is a level of expertise. And in a way, it's a combination of fact checking. I mean, ones that are, and then again, this is a profession. So everyone down the line has got to be compensated adequately for their time and their expertise. And it can make, I mean, there is no one, especially arguments about that. It's like, well, we're writing about science, not society. And I just, after I've stopped laughing, is
Science is done by people, and people are jerks.
yeah, and I'm just like, and so having those types of checks, to me, it's just another type of fact checking, and it's more and more popular. But when it goes really wrong, it happens immediately. Like you're like, there's been a disturbance of the force.
Oh,
And
yeah.
then, like you're like, oh, that's what caused it. Like when it's come really, really crashing down. So yeah.
And this is especially true for, there's some really great work coming out in what's called traditional ecological knowledge, which is knowledge systems of indigenous cultures. And like, they've been living on their land for 10,000 years. They know what they're looking at, right? So people are now, scientists are now going to them and being like, so we noticed that you've been seeing things and we've been ignoring you for the past 10,000 years. How do we make it up to you?
Well, I would say white scientists.
Yes,
Yeah,
white
it's
scientists.
like-
And so, you have more of that coming in to actual science writing, and it's wonderful. But when white people like me try to write about indigenous cultures, we will screw up, you guys. And that's why we need sensitivity readers.
yeah.
So we spent a lot of time talking about specifically science journalism. I want to open up the chance to talk about other formats of science writing and what you enjoy about them, and any wisdom you can give us about how to make it interesting and fun.
I don't know about wisdom, but so I write a lot about well, a lot of times when things go horribly wrong, especially being a forensic chemist, I'm never showing up when things are all right in the world. But also like the intersection of science and pop culture. And what I would say is, especially with true crime is trendy. Is that the right? It's very
So
odd to say
trendy.
it's trendy.
It's on
right now.
trend.
It's having a moment.
Having a moment. And I, before I became a professor, I worked in a crime lab, and it is very weird sometimes to say, oh, I love murder, or, and I know it might be a joke, or, I love true crime. It's so interesting to me. Sometimes the way it's presented, people, honestly, I'm like, did you forget what you were talking about and who you're talking to? And that kind of cavalier. But I do think there is a way to do it so that, at some point, is there a way to deliver information? And we do this in our daily lives, difficult, challenging, emotionally charged, but sometimes you're going to crack a joke, or you're going to be a bit lighthearted in some instances, and gallows humor, whatever you want to call it. How do you do that, and when? Really comes, right? You've got to have, I think, a level of emotional intelligence, to borrow a phrase, and not only like the technical expertise, but you should also, I think, in some instances, err on the side of seriousness given certain topics. And that's just not just true crime, but also when you're dealing with, especially the kind of the research work I do, you're probably going to be running into interpersonal violence.
Yeah.
And so how do I present that in a way, and in what decisions do we make and when? And I do think that there is a way to do it. I don't know how many people have heard of the podcast Scam Goddess. Yeah, I mean, that is a crime podcast about scams, and it's by a comedian, right? So there is a way to present certain information that is, people got hurt, or they got taken advantage of, or things like that. But the joke is never on the victims. And so there is a way to present it. And then when you're talking about the science part, I write about all kinds of, besides frauds, and of course, if I'm going to be talking about forensic DNA, then it probably involves some level of interpersonal violence, is, just say that up top. And so people can make decisions about what they need to be exposed to. And so I think that, content warnings are really critical, and you can do that up top and just not make a big, it's like a rating for a film.
Yeah.
It's got adult content in it, or it's got, this content in it, and then keep it moving. Right? So, and I think my tone, I try to imagine I'm telling someone a story, and how would I tell that story? I'm sure I'm going to say a pun or two. I do love a pun. I'm probably going to crack a joke or two. But if I'm telling a relative stranger, how would I do that, and when? What's the pacing? What the timing is? I always make sure I read it back to myself, and potentially read it to someone else, and so does my editor. Is it coming off the way of the intent, or is the impact different than the intent? And that is really going to depend on what it is you're talking about. And some topics, I think we've all written about those topics that really do impact people's lives in a quite intimate way. That's when it becomes even more important. Now, if I'm talking about the color dye change in Skittles between 89 and 90, you might have an emotional impact for that, but honestly,
Tell
I'm
me
not
more,
gonna
please.
care. Like, then I'm not going to maybe do some of that additional work. But that kind of investment on one side, it really does leave you with a product that you just feel more confidence in, and you enjoy more sharing.
That actually, speaking of true crime podcasts, which are definitely having a moment, I think where I kind of think about it and draw the line is, are they talking about these people, as humans, who were not just ridiculous or stereotyped or made to look stupid or something like that? Are these people? That is what I think is really key. And I think that's sometimes very hard for people kind of raised in science and who go into science writing from science, as I did, right? To me, it's not the people that matters, it's the science that matters. That is not true, because science is always done by people, and people always have agendas. They are good, they are bad, they are both.
Yeah.
And I think that's really something to think about, especially when doing like true crime podcasts, and especially the ones involving murder.
Or I mean, climate change. When
Well,
you
climate
talk about
yeah.
any of that stuff.
Yeah, so right now I'm focusing primarily on myself and my students, helping them communicate their science. I've taught a class on science communication to graduate students, and I'm really focusing on helping these junior scholars understand that they have a lot of opportunity to be nimble. Yes, they need to communicate their science very formally to peers and more senior scholars in their field, but I also recognize there's a lot of opportunity to just simply explain science. So my bailiwick has always been just explain. Like, I'm an explainer. I've always been good at the explaining part. So my first blog was really explaining ecology aimed at kids and like teenagers. And then later, when I had a blog that was designed for more adult audience, it was still about explaining like that science and evolution at more adult audience and more mature audiences, bringing in a lot of those pop culture references. So for me, the good communication, the good writing, regardless of the formality of the audience or not, is can you explain the concept? And my walkaway feature is I trust them to be able to use the information.
And usually you've done a good job of doing, I'm going to explain one concept.
Yeah, one thing.
Like, and of course, anyone who's a teacher will know what is the single student learning objective. Do you want to throw in some jargon in there? What is the one concept, the one technique, the one bit of information? And it's not because I don't think people are competent or smart or eager to learn. It's because learning is hard. And if you're throwing out 15 different concepts, like are we trying to get people to know something to some level of depth and really have an opportunity to sit with something and explore? Or are you just trying to be like, pew, 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 pew?
Yeah.
Like, what is the...
Yeah.
So sometimes it's, what's the one thing I want to communicate? Now, that one thing might be like 600 words or 5,000 words or something like that, depending on it. But it's okay to just be like, no, I just want just this. I want this one takeaway. If they come away with this one thing, instead of one life hack, if you can just leave with this one thing.
Yeah. So
I was told not to trust that.
don't trust it, right? No, but so
your
that's
one
where
life
I am.
hack: face mites have an anus. That is your life hack.
Oh no,
That's
not
my favorite.
that, lady. Like no, so right now what I'm doing with my students is taking them through their process of writing and helping them figure out their voice, helping them narrow down that message. But I help them to understand it's an iterative process because I actually struggle. Like my insecurity in my writing was horrible. I'm finally a little bit better, just a skosh. And that's because I was always told in the formal sense that I didn't know what I was doing. But then I was, so I started blogging to practice, talking about the stuff that I found great in a medium that I thought was free of all those rules and the constrictions. And folks were like, you're doing a good job. I'm like, but I get such a different message formally. But lo and behold, the blogging did help. When it was finally time, when I finally put my dissertation together, I was told like this was the best first draft they'd ever read, because I finally quit trying to mimic their types of writing style. Yes, technical science writing is very technical. There's a method to it, but what I kept trying to do was mimic their voice, and that's a challenge. So now I tell my students, no, you're allowed to have your voice. And that's not a message that many students are getting. Like, so many students are still told that their voice isn't the one. And they find themselves struggling to just repeat whoever their main trainer's voice. It's like, no, let them have their voice. It's like, did they communicate the thing and did they say it? And this idea that if you're creative or flowery, it's like there's no room for it. Actually, even at this level, things get sent back and forth from the editor. You know what? Let it fly. Let it fly. Let's see what comes back. They'll give you feedback.
Yeah, worst case, it just gets deleted.
Gets deleted or gets modified, or folks like, I see what you were going with this, but that's a little too much, so let's scale back. But you don't have to make people feel like you have no idea what you're doing, because that's a very different message. Yeah. And then how that works for me now is I now have a developing editor. So one of the ways that I focus on improving my writing this point forward is that I have an editor who helps me get my ideas from the jumble in my head to focusing on deadlines and actually getting it done, because I get excited about the ideas, and then because of my history of reluctance and insecurity and trauma of feeling like I'm not good at doing the technical stuff, I tend to avoid that.
Yeah.
And so my developing editor goes, nope, we can do this. You can do this. You know this. Start doing it. And building up my confidence. And then I then take those skills and I mimic that for my students. I go, you can do this. Just brain dump. The purpose of the first draft is to exist. That's his only job.
Yeah, I would like to say in praise of word vomit, just vomit the words on the page, because you know how it happens when you vomit and then you're like, oh, carrots. There's carrots in there.
I was going to say, you feel better finally.
Yeah, you feel better, and there's carrots, and you can work with carrots.
I would say
not
though,
those
I can't do vomit. So I have dyslexia, and all of that. Oh, just brain vomit. I have to say, what does that mean to me? I have so many tabs open. I have tabs for I can't keep things all
My
in one.
tabs have tabs.
I cannot keep everything in one document. It's too much to look at, and I don't like it. So I'm one of those people who has like how many baskets, compartments, drawer, like everything's labeled. The scratch paper is labeled scratch paper. I'm one of those people. So when I'm writing, when I do a brain dump, it's like, okay, yes, I do a brain dump, but it's still going to be section by like, you know. So when it talks about like what's your working style, what is working for you that lowers whatever the discomfort is, so that you can make some progress. And some days I'm happy if one solid sentence, one good sentence can be worth quite a bit, right? So whatever that flow is and works for you, that tends to lower and makes you feel, okay, I'm feeling good, I'm feeling workable, this is nice. Then those are those good habits. And sometimes a developing editor or writing coach or a mentor can really help get that together. And so one of the things definitely during the pandemic we're still in, but was writing groups on Zoom.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's more about like, you know, that have that friend you see that pop up in the chat. It's like, I know you're not paying attention, you know, because you want to go wander because things are getting challenging or weird, or it's doing something like, what is it? The timer is 25-5.
The Pomodoro.
Pomodoro.
I have one group that I
Love
joined
Pom.
that's that, and it's like, okay, concentrated effort for this, and then we're going to BS for 5 minutes, and then, so whatever that is,
Yeah.
Yeah.
if that works, if a social thing would work, maybe for some folks at different times that doesn't work.
Yeah.
So there are those options now that you can get in to the whatever the rhythm is. And it turns out a lot of times, especially if you're working on a big story, big feature, big cover, writing like computational work is usually a team effort. We just don't ever sometimes talk about it that way.
Yeah.
Yeah, people don't realize that like behind every famous byline of every famous science writer you've ever met, there's at least 2 editors, 1 fact checker, a copy editor, probably at least 5 people who read it while the writer was sitting here going, "Is it good? Is it good?
Yeah.
How about now? You think it's okay?" Yeah, there's a team behind there, and
3
most of them do not get
baristas, their favorite DoorDash person.
at
like,
least 1 bartender.
Yeah.
A
Yeah.
therapist.
Village.
Therapist.
Bartender slash barista.
So I'm fascinated to hear that you're dyslexic, because I am too,
Yeah,
and that your style honestly kind of matches how I do things. And I'm gonna add like giving yourself accommodations. Allowing myself to give myself accommodations was the biggest change in my career. So sometimes when I'm brain dumping, I turn on a voice-to-text program and I just ramble incoherently to my walls and my stuffed animals and myself. And it works.
I have voice recorder on my phone. Another big thing about technical writing is, and students, when I tell them this, their mind's always blown. We've taught them sometimes to read academic papers in order. I don't know where they picked up that bad habit, because I don't do
Never
that.
do that.
Nobody does that.
Nope.
Don't do it.
And they might think that we write them in order.
Oh, goodness, no.
That's so funny. So, like, no. What is the easiest thing to do? So we're an analytical group, so we're all about methodology and technique. And that's like our bread and butter. We don't even get in the lab until we've got that all mapped out. So, of course, that's already written. And once that section's written, you're going to have a figure. That's discussions. That's done. Like, you know, you start going downhill for there. And it's usually not then, it's the introduction that's always, like, typically
That's
the
the
last thing
energy
for
barrier.
my group, right?
Yeah.
It's like, dang. And then the worst, of course, is you got to do future work potentially and an abstract. And you're like,
But I wrote it all already.
how? you're getting out the thesaurus. Everyone's like,
Yeah.
no, I got the word. That's when you're like coming together to like throw it together before submission.
I actually
so
find the abstracts really hard to write. I almost always
that's the bitter end for me
my
and my group.
copy editor ends up doing most of it because I'm just like spent. I'm like, I did a thing. This is what I thought I was. What was my question? I don't remember anymore.
I kind of write the abstracts backwards, actually.
that makes
sense.
Starting with the conclusions and kind of working back.
Oh, I might try that.
Yeah.
But it's almost like a trailer sometimes where you're like, look, I know I'm going to have to tell you what this movie is about, but I can't really tell you what it's about.
Because I don't know yet.
The actual highest paid actor dies like 7 minutes in. So how do I, and like when you're doing that too, it's like, okay, I tell you, this is like the trailer that makes you want
In
to
a
see it.
world.
Right, in a world. I'm still trying to get that into one of these papers, but like, how do we, it's coming, just watch out. But how do we do that, right? And even there though, I try to show my students that the best papers they read, the ones they're really excited about, they want to share with the group, still have, why did you like it? Oh, it's really well written. It's got, and I didn't even see this coming. You're like, so it's got a twist and a narrative arc? Is that what I'm hearing from you? And that's when they realize, oh, no, even though it's quite technical or whatever, the papers that get actually read, not
Yeah.
just whatever, but the ones that get downloaded, read, really used, operationalized, are the ones with the most complete supplemental information, that are the best easily accessible writing.
Mm-hmm.
And that's when you realize, then they start really getting it. It's not just the dazzle of the top billing name and the fancy whatever. It's, oh, this is actually useful to me and it was easy to read.
So
Yeah.
actually, I want to bring that back around to science journalism for a hot second, because how many of you guys know that a science news article has a structure? Anybody? It has a well-established structure, and once you see it, you can't unsee it. And it is the same for every science news article. The only difference is length. It is absolutely true. We call it the inverted pyramid.
Yep.
Like so. That's not a pyramid. What is geometry? Okay, here. Okay, there. Like this. Okay. Anyway, there we go.
How many scientists does it take to figure out how to make a pyramid with your hand?
I'm a scientist, not a mathematician. Anyway, so basically, read a science article, pull up anything in the science section of the New York Times right now, and I promise you're going to have what we call, the top one is called the lead or the nut graph. You have the lead, and the lead is the whole like, here's the funny joke about this eel. My absolute favorite, I'm sure you guys saw, on the New York Times, Sabrina Imbler wrote the amazing headline, "When an eel climbs a ramp to steal shrimp from a clamp, that's a moray." Oh, genius. Anyway, so that was the lead. The lead was, here's this hilarious thing about moray eels, okay? Then you have your nut graph, and your nut graph is, the scientists found this thing. Then you go, well, who are these scientists? How did they find this thing? Here's the actual methodology. And as you go down the pyramid, you're drilling down from the very general conclusion to the absolute tiny thing that they did. Okay? Every science article has this structure. And then at the end, they'll blow it back out. And the blowing it back out is here's what other scientists thought about it, and here's what this means for you at home. Right? Or, hey, they reanimated pig bodies, and here's what this means for the difference between life and death. Literal science article from 2022. But yes, once you've seen it, go find a science article. I promise that structure is there every time. In some of the longer articles, like the ones you'll read in The Atlantic, the lead gets really stretched out and beautified and stuff. It's all sorts of things going on there. You'll get a scientist having a deep origin story or some shit. But it will, I'm sorry, I'm not supposed to cuss before 8. Anyway, but it will always end up drilling down to, here's what they found, here's how they did it. And once you know this, it will actually speed read your science news reading by about 300 times.
Not to go all narrative theory, but that also mimics a 3-act structure.
100% it does.
Yeah.
Which is really cool once you start recognizing it. When you've the 3-act structure, you've got the world in order, which is sort of what everyone is comfortable with, the day-to-day, which from a reader is the nut graph. It's going to be very easy to understand. And then you get to the world in chaos, which is where things get really difficult, and that's where you get technical and get into the things that's as far out of the reader's comfort zone as humanly possible. And then you zoom back out, you get to the world in new order, or the synthesis section, Act 3, where you take all the things you learned in the world in chaos and you synthesize it into the thing you already understood, which is why that structure works so
And
well.
by the way, this is not limited to science. Every political article also has this
Oh, for
structure.
sure.
Yeah.
Every single one.
And you'll see them right in the crime section. It's the same type of thing. I think, and it's funny, when you were describing all of this, it reminds me too, is even though we talk about, be very careful in, I would say like manipulative calls to emotion, we have to know that we are emotional beings. We respond to stories. There's so much great research, especially in science communication, about storytelling and science, and we've been doing that since we decided to invent language. But we know when it's different, and not to quote a Supreme Court justice, but you know it when you see it. You know it when you hear it.
Yes,
when it's,
stories aren't inherently bad.
Right.
Stories are very good.
well, they're a way for one author or storyteller to relate to someone else. I'm trying to relate to you, and that might mean to establish some level of trust. It might mean to communicate, I'm the one that should be telling this story, or I was there, I'm part of this community, whatever that thing is. But when does it maybe go too far? What's the unethical manipulation? That's when we need to be, what was that? And sometimes it's hard to pinpoint exactly when that is, and sometimes you're like, it when you hear it, when you see it, that it's gone too far. But it's not, the answer is not to avoid emotion, as you've said. So we can't avoid emotion. We are human beings doing a human activity of science. But there are limits, and that's why I think the team approach is really critical.
Is that emotion backed by reality? Or is it just emotion backed by more emotion backed by Facebook memes?
So
But long form writing has the use to tell stories and convey very complicated concepts. And B, I'm sure you encountered that within your writing your book. And when I was writing my book, it was the stories specifically that made the information in particular accessible.
Yes.
And it's the stories that makes the information at all worthwhile consuming.
I would say the stories that I use are stories that illustrate my point. There's a difference between stories and emotions that illustrate your point and stories and emotions that are your point. Right? Are you illustrating a point? What is the point you're illustrating, and what are the caveats? Right? I think that's really key. But yeah, I think that's the thing, is you want your stories to kind of be the ones that illuminate the point you're trying to make.
So we have just under 10 minutes left, and I want to make sure we have a little time for audience to ask questions, if there are any burning questions.
Burning
There's an
questions.
ointment for that.
I think I saw this hand over here first, yeah.
The mic is coming.
Oh, great. Sorry, I forgot to warn the science track.
Hey, so thinking about science communication, I was thinking of a YouTube series I've seen a number of times that Wired does, where they have one concept that they have someone explain at 5 different levels.
Oh yes, that's a really good series. I love that series.
So I'm curious, with that question of what level you're pitching your explanation at. Is that something that you know going into writing, or is that something that develops through the process of creating the article or story or whatever?
For me, I know the level of writing that I have to start at de novo, because you're going to identify the audience that you're going to be writing for, and that really shapes what it is that you're going to do. So in my day job, I'm writing either tech briefs for politicians, I'm writing summaries for decision makers that are going to deliver actual science funding, and depending on those people, maybe I'm just summarizing things that happened, or maybe I'm actually trying to pitch and sell this idea to get funded. And knowing the purpose of the outcome of the writing really dictates where it is I'm setting that technical level of detail.
Yeah, agree. So a lot of my public writing, I am intentionally focusing to make it very accessible to historically underserved audiences. So urban African American audiences, because they have not they've been intentionally focused on. So I'm using a lot of pop culture references there. I mean, the rule of thumb is that the average newspaper, reads for someone with a 10th grade reading level historically.
The average science reading level is 5th grade.
Fifth, really?
Hmm.
So I'm kind of wavering between K-12. Like, I want it super accessible. I still introduce the big words, but I make a point to either explain things, and because it's more important that folks get the concept, or at least connect to the concept. Fancy words are just fancy words. And interestingly, I take that into my college teaching. I tell my students, you actually know quite a bit of science. I'm going to teach you a lot of specifics. There's some things you probably don't know, but a lot of the big picture stuff you get. You have a concept of the world. I'm here to help you clarify it and give you lots of Jeopardy words.
So can we get another question? We only have 5 minutes left, so we're going to popcorn style this since there were a couple of hands.
Thanks. You touched on it just briefly with the technical writing. I was just wondering if you had any sort of tips on how to make it actually sort of readable for sometimes it can get quite dry and whatnot.
Well, I think sometimes it's the purpose of it might be simply to put this here, do this. Sometimes there's just not a way to spice it up. I think what I would think in that case is brevity is more important than entertainment.
Mm-hmm.
Because sometimes I'm technical writing, I'm like, we're still in it. And it's like, sure, it serves a purpose. How fast can we get to the correct thing? And because it's like, no, their brain is just gonna, at some point, it's IKEA directions.
Clarity over cleverness is what
Yeah.
we say in UX writing.
Yeah.
Another question?
Sorry, I sat all the way near the outlet over here. I'm a social scientist by training. How would y'all distinguish writing for social, quote-unquote, soft sciences versus the hard sciences?
I think you're actually harder, but
Oh,
I
yes.
appreciate
Yeah.
this.
That sounds about right.
Much harder.
I don't know if I would say actually, again, thank you, social science. You guys
Yes.
have also been slagged off recently, so that's not cool.
They're doing good work.
But
Yeah.
I think social science, right? It actually, there's some great social science work on science communication that really informs
Yeah.
how we do the actual and how it impacts people. So, to me, it's social science.
It's
There's research
science.
component. You're delivering this information. You've studied it qualitatively and quantitatively.
Yeah, social
I
science
don't-
is science.
I don't see now when I say that though, I
It's
know
not-
that there's specific discipline. Danielle, she's a biologist and I'm a chemist. There are distinct ways, jargons, things that we're
Yeah.
going to need to do. But when it comes to sometimes the overall structure in context, considering the impact on society, I would say we actually have a lot in common. That would be my personal opinion.
Yeah.
Nice.
Okay, so for context, I'm an elementary educator with a degree in physics. So what role would you say that science writing, science journalism plays in science education?
Ooh, okay. When I first became a science journalist, I remember one of my editors sitting me down and being like, "We are not education, we are information."
Yikes.
And I went, "Can I cuss for a second?" What the f*** does that mean? What does that mean? That means nothing. And I still think, Tom, that was nonsense. Anyway, I think you must be informed to educate.
Yeah.
There is information and education in everything that we do. And often to convey the latest science news, I have to educate my audience first. Mm-hmm. That is absolutely needed. I think, well, first of all, thank you for your service. I think that science writing and science communication is kind of the next step to help people keep developing themselves, but it is the science educators that form our readers.
Facts.
And I think that science journalists in particular ignore this at their peril.
Facts. Facts.
There's some great working groups. I had an opportunity to work on one where it was a mix of, and it was kind of broken up into, quote, informal, we love categories, informal and formal science education. And the journalism folks and the museum folks, which are doing solid, and they were in the informal only because of certain, they didn't have maybe city council structures and federal education guidelines and like SLOs and all these things. And then we had the formal people, but of course the formal folks, sometimes more so just by training and experience and a social science background of the developing brain, of education, of learning uptake for different types of, this, all of that. It was being in that kind of a joint group. Even though we have maybe big goals, you can see the levels of expertise that are actually helping, and while again, we have different goals and different roles and things like that, there are clearly these points where this part of the Venn diagram is the key that we can really get to. So I think when we have these types of projects that we can work on, public health is a great example. There have been some great public health kind of campaigns. Food safety, where they bringing in this kind of super team Avengers of folks like that. And that's when you can really get some traction and movement on that area, is when we all in the general space work together.
So unfortunately, we are at time. So I'm going to thank our panel for all of your wonderful insight. Thank you all for coming out. Science track folks, do you want to do the spiel? I don't have it memorized.
Here's a spiel.
But come to Solve for X tonight, 10 p.m.
Well, that was one of the things that I was going to say. So please go to Solve for X tonight at 10 p.m. in the Hilton, at the Crystal Ballroom. Do you remember where it is, Ray?
It's Hilton Grand Ballroom East.
Grand Ballroom East. Thank you for coming. If you enjoyed this panel, and even if you didn't, please make sure that you take some time to rate it and leave any comments that you like in the DragonCon app. That does really matter to us. And that was all that we had. So thank you very much.